Welcome to this Science First breakdown on L-Tyrosine for cold exposure. Today we are looking at a very specific question. Can tyrosine help maintain mental performance when cold stress starts to drain your ability to think clearly, remember instructions, and execute under pressure? This is not a discussion about using tyrosine as a stimulant, a fat burner, or a magic cold weather hack. The focus is narrower and more useful. Cold exposure can challenge both the body and the brain, especially in situations where decisions matter. That could mean winter endurance events, mountaineering, rescue work, tactical operations, or outdoor labor. Our goal is to separate evidence from marketing and explain where tyrosine might actually fit. By the end, you should understand why the best case for tyrosine is not more energy, but possible cognitive protection under meaningful stress. Cold exposure is often treated as a physical challenge, but this slide reminds us that the brain is under pressure too. When you are cold, uncomfortable, and distracted, the question becomes whether you can still execute the tasks that matter. First, you need to remember mission-critical information even while your attention is split between the environment, your body, and the task. Second, you need to decide correctly while discomfort and urgency compete for mental bandwidth. Third, you need to execute those decisions with controlled movement and accuracy. This is why the supplement question only matters if these functions are actually threatened. If the cold is mild and the task is simple, there may be little deficit to preserve. But if the cold impairs memory, judgment, or motor control, then preserving cognition becomes a meaningful performance target. This slide frames the conversation in an anti-hype way. The real question is not whether tyrosine makes you feel stimulated like caffeine. The real question is whether one amino acid can help preserve cognition when cold stress is draining it. That distinction matters because a lot of supplement marketing tries to turn every focus ingredient into an energy booster. Tyrosine is not being evaluated here as a warmer body supplement, a stimulant energy product, or a cold-proof performance shield. Those claims go beyond the evidence. The more reasonable claim is narrower. Under cold stress, when catecholamine systems are under demand, tyrosine might help maintain certain cognitive functions. We should judge it by that standard. If someone says tyrosine will make you immune to cold or instantly energized, that is marketing, not a science-based claim. Cold does not need to feel extreme before it starts affecting performance. A systematic review of controlled studies found that most cold exposure experiments reported impairment in at least one cognitive domain. The affected areas included attention, processing speed, executive function, and memory. This matters because these functions are often needed before someone realizes they are in trouble. You may still feel capable, but your reaction time, judgment, or ability to update information may already be slipping. The effects vary depending on temperature, exposure method, exposure duration, task type, clothing, acclimation, and individual differences. That means cold exposure does not impair everyone in the exact same way. Still, the pattern is clear enough to take seriously. Cold can become a cognitive stressor, not just a comfort issue. This is the foundation for asking whether tyrosine might help preserve performance in certain cold situations. Working memory is your ability to hold information online long enough to use it. In cold environments, that ability can become a bottleneck. Think about navigation. You may need to track where you are, remember route changes, and keep the next step in mind while your body is uncomfortable. In a procedural task, you may need to remember a sequence while your hands are occupied and attention is divided. In communication, you may need to retain instructions while filtering noise, urgency, and discomfort. In judgment, you may need to compare options without losing sight of the goal or constraints. Cold-related cognitive decrements are not universal, but when they appear, the consequences can compound quickly. A missed instruction can lead to a wrong decision, and a wrong decision can lead to poor execution. That is why working memory is central to this topic. This slide shifts from cognition to execution. Cold hands can turn a correct decision into a poor outcome. You may know exactly what you need to do, but if your grip strength, dexterity, timing, and control are impaired, the result can still be sloppy or unsafe. The sequence shown on the slide is important. First, grip can suffer as fingers become colder and less responsive. Second, timing slows as reaction and movement speed decline. Third, control becomes less precise, meaning movement errors become more likely. Finally, accuracy suffers, especially during technical tasks. This is why psychomotor outcomes matter in cold stress research. Mood or perceived energy alone does not tell us whether someone can operate equipment, handle a tool, perform a rescue task, or make a controlled movement under pressure. Cold performance is about both deciding and executing. Cold exposure becomes more important when the task carries consequences. In tactical settings, accuracy under pressure can matter. In technical work, missing a procedural step can create danger. In endurance events, decisions late in effort can determine whether an athlete paces correctly, navigates safely, or responds to changing conditions. In rescue situations, fine motor skill and urgency combine. Outdoor shift work brings long exposure plus fatigue. The standard question becomes, can you still remember, decide, and execute when comfort is gone? This slide clarifies that the best use case for tyrosine is not a casual gym session in a slightly cold room. It is a context where cold stress, cognitive load, and real consequences overlap. The more complex and demanding the task, the more relevant the hypothesis becomes. L-tyrosine is a non-essential amino acid, meaning your body can synthesize it. Non-essential does not mean unimportant. It simply means you do not need to obtain all of it from food because your body can produce some on its own. Tyrosine is also supplied by protein-rich foods such as meat, dairy, eggs, soy, beans, nuts, and other protein sources. From a supplement perspective, the key point is that tyrosine is not caffeine. It does not directly block adenosine receptors or provide a classic stimulant kick. Its relevance comes from its biochemical role as a precursor used in catecholamine synthesis. In other words, supplementation changes substrate availability. It gives the body more raw material for pathways related to dopamine and norepinephrine. That is very different from saying it automatically creates energy, focus, or performance. This slide shows the basic biochemical pathway. L-tyrosine can be converted to L-dopa, which can then become dopamine. Dopamine can be converted downstream to norepinephrine, and in certain tissues, epinephrine is synthesized further along the pathway. This pathway matters because dopamine and norepinephrine are involved in motivation, attention, working memory, alertness, and stress response. The key caveat is that pathway position supports plausibility, not proof. Just because tyrosine sits upstream of important neurotransmitters does not mean taking more tyrosine automatically produces more neurotransmitter or better performance. The brain regulates these systems carefully. Transport into the brain, enzyme activity, baseline stress level, and feedback mechanisms all matter. This pathway explains why tyrosine might help when demand is high. It does not justify universal focus claims. Catecholamines such as dopamine and norepinephrine help coordinate several mental systems that matter during stressful performance. Attention helps you select what matters and ignore irrelevant distractions. Working memory helps you hold and update information as conditions change. Motivation supports goal-directed effort, especially when discomfort rises. Alertness allows you to respond to changing conditions. The stress response mobilizes the body and brain when there is threat or urgency. These systems are highly regulated. More precursor does not automatically mean more neurotransmitter, and more neurotransmitter does not automatically mean better function. There is usually an optimal zone. Too little arousal can impair performance, but too much stress can also impair performance. Tyrosine may be relevant when stress starts to deplete or challenge catecholamine function, but that is a different claim from saying it always increases focus. This slide presents a plausible stress context model. Cold stress increases neural demand. That can increase catecholamine turnover, which then creates performance pressure. When neurons are highly active, precursor availability may matter more than it does at rest. This is where tyrosine becomes interesting. It may not do much in comfortable, low-demand conditions because the system already has enough substrate and is not strained. But under cold stress, when dopamine and norepinephrine systems are working harder, tyrosine might help preserve performance by supporting catecholamine synthesis. This is a mechanism-based argument, and the mechanism is credible. However, the size and reliability of the benefit still depend on the real-world context. Temperature, duration, task type, baseline nutrition, sleep, and individual physiology will all influence whether tyrosine makes a noticeable difference. The key idea here is context. Tyrosine may matter most when demand is already high, because that is when catecholamine systems are more likely to be challenged. In comfortable conditions, there may be little deficit to rescue. If you are well-rested, well-fed, warm, and doing a routine task, extra tyrosine may feel like nothing. That does not mean the supplement is useless. It means it may not be relevant to that situation. The best framing is stress context support, not all-purpose focus enhancement. This distinction is important for honest supplement education. If someone expects tyrosine to feel like a stimulant before every workout, they are likely to be disappointed. If someone uses it in a situation where cold, fatigue, and cognitive demand threaten performance, the hypothesis becomes more reasonable. This slide explains what a realistic benefit might look like. In a thermoneutral environment, performance may sit at baseline. Under cold stress, placebo performance may decline because the brain and body are challenged. Tyrosine, if effective, may keep performance closer to baseline. That is a preservation effect. It is not necessarily a boost above normal. This distinction matters because users often judge supplements by whether they feel more energized or perform beyond baseline. Tyrosine may not work that way. A benefit could look like less decline during stress, not a new level of stimulation. In practical terms, the question becomes, did you make fewer mistakes, remember instructions better, react more accurately, or maintain execution under cold stress? That is a more realistic standard than expecting a caffeine-like surge. The key principle on this slide captures the entire evidence-based position. Tyrosine is not a focused booster for every situation. It is a stress context support tool. The mechanism is plausible because tyrosine is a catecholamine precursor. The evidence is promising but limited, especially in cold stress and other demanding contexts. Marketing often overextends the claim by implying that tyrosine should improve focus in any situation, for any user, at any dose. That is not what the research supports. A more careful interpretation is that tyrosine might help maintain mental performance when stress is high enough to threaten catecholamine-dependent functions. This is why the context matters as much as the ingredient. Stress, task demand, and dosing all determine whether the claim makes sense. One of the key cold exposure studies used a controlled cold chamber set around 4 degrees Celsius and examined working memory. Participants received an acute tyrosine dose of 150 mg per kilogram, which is a high research dose. Under placebo, cold exposure reduced delayed matching accuracy, especially at longer memory delays. Tyrosine restored performance at the delay most affected by cold. This is an important signal because it does not show a universal cognitive upgrade. It shows that a specific cold-induced working memory deficit was alleviated. That is exactly the type of claim we should focus on, targeted cognitive preservation under stress. However, because the dose was high and the setting controlled, we should be careful about translating it casually to everyday pre-workout use. Another important study used cold water immersion, which creates a strong physiological stressor. 19 volunteers were exposed to approximately 10 degrees Celsius water during 2 90-minute immersion sessions. The total tyrosine dose was 300 mg per kilogram, delivered as repeated dosing during the protocol. Tyrosine increased correct responses and shortened study time on a matched sample task compared with cold placebo. That suggests faster and more accurate processing under cold stress. Still, the cold condition increased errors and slowed choice reaction time overall, meaning tyrosine did not erase the effect of cold. It appeared to reduce part of the cognitive decline. This study is promising, but the repeated high-dose protocol is not a casual template for supplementation. It tells us that under severe cold stress, tyrosine may help, but generalization requires caution. Cold water immersion research also reminds us that cognition is not the only concern. Psychomotor performance matters because the body has to execute what the brain decides. In some cold water studies, tyrosine benefited several cognitive and psychomotor outcomes, including marksmanship-related performance after immersion. That is relevant because marksmanship combines perception, attention, decision timing, fine motor control, and emotional regulation. Still, this was a small controlled study. A controlled laboratory setting is not the same as a field operation with unpredictable weather, gear issues, sleep loss, and emotional pressure. The signal is promising, especially for tactical and technical tasks, but it is not a field guarantee. Tyrosine may support performance in certain cold stress scenarios, but preparation, training, gear, and environmental management remain more important. The slide summarizes the evidence honestly. The mechanism is supported. Tyrosine is a catecholamine precursor. The cold stress studies are promising for working memory and psychomotor performance, but the evidence is still limited for broader physical performance, and tyrosine is not proven to warm the body or prevent hypothermia. That means we need to be precise with claims. Tyrosine may help preserve certain mental functions during cold stress. It is not a general performance enhancer for all conditions. It is not an insulation replacement, a thermogenic compound, or a rescue tool for poor preparation. The word promising should not be treated as proven. A serious supplement discussion should hold both ideas at once. There is a meaningful signal worth paying attention to, but the evidence is too narrow for broad recommendations. Beyond cold exposure, tyrosine has been studied in operational stress contexts. One study looked at 21 military cadets during a demanding week of combat training. Participants received a tyrosine drink multiple times per day with a protocol totaling 5 2-gram doses. Compared with an isocaloric carbohydrate drink, the tyrosine group performed better on memory and tracking tasks during the training course. That is operationally relevant because real stress is often multi-layered. fatigue, decision pressure, physical effort, and cognitive load all happened together. However, the sample size was small, and the protocol was multi-day, not a simple single-dose pre-workout study. The findings suggest that tyrosine might support cognitive performance during demanding operational stress, but it does not prove that casual users need it for ordinary training. In operational environments, the value of a supplement is not about feeling energized. It is about making fewer costly errors. This slide breaks that down into 4 functions. First, retain instructions so they remain available when conditions change. Second, track targets, routes, or task sequences as the environment evolves. Third, decide under fatigue, urgency, or stress. Fourth, execute with precision and timing. That is a very different promise for more energy. A stimulant feeling may not protect memory or execution, especially under cold stress. Tyrosine's best case is that it may help preserve the mental systems needed to avoid errors under demand. That is why the practical question should be, does this situation involve cognitive risk that matters? If yes, tyrosine becomes more relevant. If no, it may be unnecessary. This slide contrasts high-stakes cold exposure with a normal gym session. In high-stakes cold, you may need navigation, communication, marksmanship, rescue procedures, and equipment handling. Those tasks involve memory, judgment, precision, and composure. In a typical gym session, the environment is comfortable, exposure is short, cognitive stakes are low, and users often expect a caffeine-like feeling. These are very different contexts. The stronger the stressor and the greater the cognitive demand, the more relevant tyrosine becomes. For normal gym focus, caffeine has a stronger and more direct evidence base. Tyrosine is more interesting when stress threatens cognition. This helps avoid the common mistake of applying military or cold exposure findings to routine lifting sessions that do not resemble the research context. Here we identify practical scenarios where tyrosine may make the most sense. Winter endurance events can require pacing, navigation, and route decisions late in effort. Mountaineering can involve technical sequences and navigation under cold, fatigue, and altitude. Search and rescue requires urgency, communication, and fine motor skill. Tactical operations require accuracy under compounded stress. Outdoor shift work may involve long cold exposure and sustained attention. So, cold water tasks can challenge decision-making while dexterity is compromised. These are the types of situations that align with the evidence base because cold stress and cognitive demand overlap. The common thread is not simply it is cold. The common thread is that cognitive or psychomotor failure would matter. That is where a stress support tool may be more relevant. This slide offers 3 questions to ask before considering tyrosine. First, is the exposure long or severe enough to create meaningful stress? Mild cold or brief exposure may not create a deficit. Second, does success depend on memory, judgment, reaction, or fine motor control? If the task is simple and low risk, there may be little to preserve. Third, are gear, fueling, hydration, sleep, and planning already handled? Supplements should come after preparation, not before. If the answer to these questions is no, tyrosine is probably solving the wrong problem. This framework keeps the discussion practical. It shifts the question from should I take tyrosine to is there a stress-related cognitive deficit that tyrosine might realistically help preserve. The slide addresses 2 common myths. Myth 1, tyrosine should feel like caffeine. Fact, tyrosine is not a stimulant and may feel subtle or like nothing at all. If you are judging it by whether it gives a buzz, you are using the wrong standard. Myth 2, tyrosine helps you warm up faster. Fact, tyrosine does not directly warm the body. It does not replace clothing, insulation, movement, food, or safe exposure planning. Normal gym sessions and low-stress cold exposure are weak matches for the evidence. If the goal is simply to feel energized, caffeine or other stimulant strategies are more direct. Tyrosine is better framed as a possible cognitive preservation tool when stress threatens performance. A major practical issue is dosing. Some cold stress studies used 150 milligrams per kilogram, which would be 12 grams of L-Tyrosine for an 80 kilogram adult. That is far above what many supplement labels provide. Typical products may contain only 0.5 to 2 grams, and proprietary blends may hide the exact amount. This matters because evidence from a high-dose protocol cannot automatically be applied to a low-dose label. A product can include tyrosine and still be far below research-matched dosing. At the same time, a research dose is not a universal recommendation. High gram doses may not be necessary or tolerable for every user. The main point is transparency. If you do not know the amount, you cannot compare the product to the evidence. Some research used repeated high dosing rather than a single small serving. In the cold water study, participants consumed 2 doses of 150 milligrams per kilogram, totaling 300 milligrams per kilogram across the exposure period. For an 80-kilogram person, that would be a very large amount. The protocol paired each 90-minute immersion with a research dose. That is not a casual pre-workout template. Large acute doses may cause gastrointestinal discomfort, especially if taken all at once. Lower or divided doses may be easier to tolerate, but they do not reproduce the studied exposure. This is why we should avoid taking a study protocol and turning it into a general recommendation. The dose, exposure, task, and duration all mattered in the research. This slide is an important reality check. Tyrosine is not proven to warm the body, prevent hypothermia, replace insulation, replace food or hydration, guarantee physical performance, or erase sleep debt and fatigue. Cold performance starts with preparation. That means appropriate clothing, insulation, nutrition, hydration, pacing, sleep, safety planning, and knowing when to stop. Supplements remain secondary. If someone uses tyrosine as an excuse to take more risk in cold conditions, that is a misuse of the evidence. At best, tyrosine may help preserve certain cognitive functions under cold stress. It does not protect you from the physiological dangers of cold exposure. This distinction is critical for safety, especially in outdoor, tactical, or rescue contexts where overconfidence can become dangerous. Tyrosine is generally considered safe for many healthy adults, but medical context matters. Anyone with thyroid disease or using thyroid hormone should be cautious because tyrosine is involved in pathways related to thyroid hormone synthesis. People taking monoamine oxidase inhibitors should avoid unsupervised use due to possible blood pressure interactions. Individuals taking levodopa for Parkinson's disease should also seek medical guidance because tyrosine may interact with related pathways. Blood pressure concerns, cardiovascular disease, psychiatric medications, pregnancy, breastfeeding, or any major medical condition should prompt discussion with a qualified healthcare professional. It is also important not to frame tyrosine as a treatment for ADHD, depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue, or any medical condition. This is a supplement with a narrow performance hypothesis, not medical therapy. The final verdict is balanced. What holds up? The mechanism is credible. Cold stress cognition is a plausible target. Human signals in cold and operational stress settings are promising. What limits the claim? The studies use small samples, controlled settings, high research doses, and broader evidence remains mixed. What fails? Warming claims, hypothermia prevention claims, caffeine comparisons, and universal dosing rules. Tyrosine may help some people stay mentally sharper in the cold when the task involves memory, decision-making, or psychomotor control, but it will not make anyone cold-proof. The narrow lane is this. When cold stress threatens cognition, tyrosine may be worth considering as a support tool after preparation is already handled. For routine focus, normal workouts, or mild cold, the evidence is much less compelling.